Rip Van Winkle. Once upon a time, there lived a nice and simple man named Rip Van Winkle. He lived in a small house in a village not far from the Catskill Mountains in America. All the people in the village liked him very much. Local children were very fond of him because he taught them how to fly kites and how to play marbles. Rip always enjoyed playing with the children. He also liked to tell them scary stories about ghosts and witches. The local children would follow Rip wherever he went and enjoyed playing tricks on him. And although Rip often had arguments with his wife, many of the local women were always on his side. Rip liked to go hunting. He would shoot birds and wild animals with his gun. He was also always happy to help his neighbors with any jobs they had. He would help them fix fences and care for their crops. He was very good at helping other people, but he was not so good at looking after his own farm and family. He had actually given up on his own farm. Everything about the place was completely wrong. His fences always fell down, his cows would go astray, and weeds took over all of his vegetable patches. It was the worst farm in the area. His children were also ragged and wild. But despite all this, Rip was happy with his life. But his wife was not so happy about their poor life. She often shouted at Rip, calling him lazy and careless. Rip just shrugged his shoulders whenever she complained. Rip's best friend was his dog called Wolf. Mrs. Van Winkle didn't like Rip's dog either. She considered the animal lazy. Rip's married life became worse. The more uncomfortable he felt, the more time he spent at the local pub with his friends. The wise old men of the village would all gather together to gossip. The local headmaster, Mr. Derek Van Bummel, would sometimes read to them from newspapers that had been left by travelers. But it was the village elder and the owner of the pub, Mr. Nicholas Vedder, who had the strongest opinions and ideas. When he heard something that pleased him, he would slowly inhale the smoke from his pipe. But if he did not like what he was being told, Mr. Vedder blew thick clouds of smoke into the air. One day, Rip climbed up part of the Catskill Mountains with Wolf to go shooting squirrels. By late afternoon he was very tired, so he lay down under a tree with his dog to rest. From here, he had a beautiful view of all the countryside spreading out below him. He could even see the waters of the Hudson River gently flowing. Evening gradually fell upon him. Rip knew he would get home late, and he was sure that his wife would not be happy. All of a sudden, he heard a voice calling out his name. But when he turned around, all he could see was a crow flying in the sky. He continued to walk on, but then he heard his name again. "Rip Van Winkle! Rip Van Winkle!" a voice called out. Rip noticed that Wolf was scared and that he was growling. Rip felt nervous as he looked in the direction Wolf was facing. He thought he could see a person climbing over the rocks. Rip thought it must be one of his neighbors, so he went to help the person. The man was carrying something that looked quite heavy. When Rip got closer, he saw a strange-looking man dressed in old-fashioned Dutch clothes. The man, who was carrying a barrel of liquor, asked Rip to help him with his heavy load. Rip gave him a hand. Rip and the man walked over the mountains in silence. Rip could not imagine why the man was bothering to carry the heavy barrel. After some time, they came into an area of the mountains where some strange-looking people were playing a game similar to bowling. They also wore old-fashioned clothes. The men all had beards, and some wore hats. Rip thought that they all looked serious. When he and his companion approached them, the men stopped playing their game. Rip was ordered to serve liquor to them. He was trembling, but the men just stared at him and drank the liquor. Once he relaxed, Rip also enjoyed drinking the liquor. It was good, so he drank lots more. He fell asleep. When he woke up, it was a bright, sunny morning. "Surely I didn't sleep here all night," Rip asked himself. He was still on the mountain, near to where he had first seen the old man. "Oh, I must have got quite drunk. My wife will be angry with me," he told himself. He went to pick up his gun, but all he found was a rusty rifle with the lock falling off. "Someone must be playing a joke on me," he said, scratching his head. Wolf had also disappeared. Rip whistled and called after his pet, but there was no sign of his dog. Rip only heard his voice echo throughout the mountains. Rip went back to the place where he had been the night before, when he had met the strange person. He was surprised to now find a mountain stream running through the area. He tripped and fell many times. He still could not find Wolf, and so he decided to head home because he was tired and hungry. As Rip entered his village, he met some people, but nobody that he knew. Rip was surprised because he thought he knew everybody in his village and the surrounding area. He noticed that they wore very different fashions. They also stared at him in surprise and kept rubbing their chins. When Rip rubbed his own chin, he discovered that his beard was very long. Strange children ran after him as he walked further into his village. Rip was very confused. His village was much bigger. More people lived there, but he didn't recognize anyone. There were rows of houses that he had never seen before. Everything was strange. "That liquor has sent me mad," Rip thought nervously. In the end, he found his own house. He expected Mrs. Van Winkle to come running out the door any minute, but all was silent. The house was falling to bits. The windows and doors were broken, and the roof had fallen in. A half-starved dog that looked like Wolf was near the door. The animal growled at Rip. Inside the house was empty. Rip was scared. He called out for his wife and children, but there was only silence. He ran down to the village pub, but it was gone. Just a wooden building stood there. It was also a pub. People were drinking and talking inside. Rip looked for his friends, Mr. Vedder and Mr. Van Bummel, but he could not find them. He heard a man talking about something that did not make any sense to him. Some of the men in the pub started asking him questions, but Rip did not understand what they were asking him. A nicely dressed gentleman pushed forward and asked Rip what he was doing in the pub. "I'm looking for old friends," said Rip. "Who are these friends? Name them," demanded the man. "Nicholas Vedder is one of them," replied Rip. There was silence, and then an old man called out, "Mr. Vedder's been dead for 18 years. "Well, where's Brom Dutcher?" asked Rip. "Oh, he was killed in the war. He never came back," said someone else in the pub. "What about Van Bummel, the headmaster?" said Rip. "He went off to the war too, became a great general, and is now a politician," explained somebody else. Rip was very sad. His home and his friends were all gone. He found himself all alone in the world and was confused. In despair, he then called out, "Does anyone here know Rip Van Winkle?" "Rip Van Winkle's over there by the tree," exclaimed a couple of people. Rip turned to see a man who looked identical to the man he had once been, leaning against a tree. "I feel ill," Rip moaned to himself. "I don't understand what is happening. Who am I?" The people in the pub also started to look concerned. They also thought the old man was crazy. "We should take the gun off him before he does anything stupid," whispered one man to another. At that moment, a pretty woman pushed forward. She held a chubby child in her arms. The child began to cry. "Shh! Be quiet, Rip," she said to the little boy. "The old man won't hurt you." The name of the child, the woman's face, and her voice reminded Rip of something. "What is your name?" Rip asked her. "It's Judith Gardenier," she replied. "And your father's name?" he asked. "Oh, my poor father. Rip Van Winkle was his name." "It's 20 years since my father left home with his gun," the woman told him. "He never returned. Only his dog came home. We don't know what happened to him, whether he was carried away by some other people or he shot himself. I was just a little girl at that time." Rip had one more thing to ask. "Where's your mother?" The woman looked at him and said, "I'm afraid she died not so long ago." Rip could not control himself any longer. He hugged the woman and her child. "I am your father," he cried. "I am Rip Van Winkle." He turned to the crowd of people staring at him. "I was once young Rip Van Winkle, but now I am old Rip Van Winkle. Does anyone know poor Rip Van Winkle?" Everyone was amazed. An old woman went over to Rip to look closely at his face. "He is speaking the truth. It is Rip!" she cried. Where have you been for 20 years? Soon everybody knew Rip's story. For him, his one night on the mountain had really been 20 years. One old man said that he had heard that the mountain was haunted by strange beings. The man Rip had seen leaning against the tree was actually his son. Rip went home with his daughter. They all lived a long and happy life.